Howdy, hello, Dr. G here. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the U.S. regional cuisine of New England. So the first thing before we get into talking about New England, I want to talk a little bit more about what makes regional cuisine. So it is, when we talk about regional cuisines, we're talking about local food preferences that are based on broad generalities. So, and these are historical food preferences. They may not be what is commonly consumed now, but this is what has been consumed over time. The other thing to know is, particularly with the advent of such a global society and the mobility of society, we're seeing a lot of variability, and some of these regional differences are being blended. But this is historical regional cuisines. And also note that when we're talking about regional cuisines, if you're from a specific area, you may say, wait, that doesn't reflect what my family ate. And it might not, because you might have had family preferences that were different than the local cuisines, or it may be that your family came from a different area or were a minority within that region. So that's one thing. And the other thing that we focus on when we talk about regional cuisines is that it's what was cooked at home, not necessarily out in restaurants. We're looking at local ingredients that this gives us a, quote, taste of the place you're in because you're using local ingredients. Now remember, now we're very mobile, and the society in general, we can shift things back and forth and ship things over rail and cargo plane and train and boats, and so we get lots of things that we didn't used to before. But when we think about local stuff, just like with all the other regions that we've talked about, the geography and the climate's really important. Seasonality was important in playing a role in what was cooked and prepared, because the freshness is appropriate. But we also see the influence of ethnicity and religious practices that play a role in the foods that were consumed. And again, I've talked about we're going to be talking about local history and maybe a little bit of current trends, but not so much. So hopefully that gives you a good intro. So let's talk about what we're going to be talking about today in this lecture, New England. So New England is made up of 6 states that are the north and eastmost states. So we have Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. They're right next to each other. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and my beloved Connecticut. So New England is very well known as being simple. Simple, not complex, as far as what was prepared. A lot of things were prepared based on either Native American or British cooking techniques, and that's because those were the 2 people groups that played the biggest role in New England fare, right? So you had the natives, and then you had the British migrants coming over, the quote settlers coming over, and they blended their cooking patterns and ways together. We see a lot of roasting, boiling, and stewing. That's a lot like British cooking. Cream was often used and still is often used, and now it's more ice cream kind of stuff. But you'll see in different things that we talk about that cream, that there is a dairy component there. And this is one, hopefully I'll help you remember, strong seasonings are avoided. And I'll tell you that my husband and I, my husband being an Italian American, he likes well-seasoned foods, but half of his family comes from the good old Mainer traditions, New England Maine traditions, and Maine being the state, by the way. And he talks about it's New England boil. So a New England boil is you just put everything in a pot and let it boil. You don't add salt or pepper. You just let it boil. And for us, my husband and myself, it's very bland. And one day he made pork chops for his family and didn't do anything super fancy to them, just grilled them, but added salt and pepper. And not in our mind, not a whole lot of black pepper, just regular amount for us. And his grandmother, not the Italian grandmother, the other grandmother, started choking because it was too peppery, too spicy for her, because she's so used to more bland, basic foods. If you could see my hands, I'm going back and forth in a straight motion, like just nothing. And it's not that it's flavorless, but it's just not super over seasoned. So, sorry, one of the things that you'll want to think about when thinking about New England are puddings. So, right, puddings is another thing we talked about in England. And when we were talking about British foods, they can be savory or sweet. They can be steamed, baked, or boiled. And I have here grunts, slumps, and flummeries to kind of show you what steamed, baked, and then molded in that one. And they are often served, or were often served at the beginning of a meal. But let me just say that this one dish I would really like you to know is called Indian pudding. And Indian pudding, this is a now version. Of course, we take pictures of now rather than 200 years ago. But Indian pudding is basically a cornmeal mush, porridge of some kind that would be left overnight in a pan, a loaf pan normally, and just left to set, and it'll congeal and harden, and so then you can slice it and add cream to it. So it's not much of anything, and honestly, some of these are also served not just at the beginning, but for dessert as well. So New England's breads are something, in America in general, we eat a lot of bread, but in New England, the traditional bread is very dense bread. You might see cornbread or rye mixed with corn, because remember, corn coming from the Native Americans. But Boston, being the capital of Massachusetts, right? Boston has its own type of bread that is consumed throughout New England, but it's called Boston brown bread. And what it is a steamed loaf of whole wheat and rye bread that it would be dark anyway, but then it's sweetened with molasses. So molasses, we think about that sugar trade, right? And that triangle, and so molasses coming up as a sweetener, it's going to be darker than regular sugar. In this picture, we see, and often nowadays when you do a traditional steamed brown bread, it'll be steamed in a can that just came from some other thing that was made, and in this case, it was beans. So I've talked before when we were talking about Native Americans and beans, and also about England and what they like to eat for breakfast, right? That we see baked beans there. Well, in New England, baked beans are also something that are consumed with maple syrup as a sweetener. And we see an added salt pork coming from some of the ways that were brought over when we think about the Spanish bringing things over. Spain wasn't really involved in New England much, but slowly pork made its way up north. All right. Other things that you want to know about, you want to know that we see a lot of different soups and ways of making meat last longer, including, I'm going to focus on this dish here that you can see a picture of. It's called red flannel hash. And so if you have leftover meat, leftover vegetables, it'd be all cut together. So in the South, we have like corned beef hash is probably the most connected thing, and certainly that is a related dish, but in red flannel, what makes it red is the beets that are added. So you can kind of see some beets in here too. So just know that what makes red flannel hash red is the beets. We've already talked about codfish balls before, fried fish and balls. You might see clam cakes and things like that, or crab cakes and things like that too. But fried fish is certainly prevalent throughout New England. And we've talked about clam bake as well when we were talking about Native Americans. One of the things I want to emphasize is I think I mentioned this at the very beginning of this course, but lobster and things that when I grew up from Texas that were really expensive and seen as high class, um, they're they're just common day food in New England that a lot of people, I mean, they don't eat it every day. I mean, if you're on the coast, maybe you do. But my husband, he really doesn't care for lobster because he grew up on too much of it and it wasn't anything outstanding to him. So I think it's kind of funny how we view food based on regions, that lobster was meh for him. But for me, it was always, oh, let's go look at the lobster tank and just think about, would we ever be able to afford having lobster? So one of the things that is common, and I kind of skipped over it a little bit, beside clam bakes, are chowders that you make soups out of clam and clam stock. There are 3 different types of chowders I want you to know. The first one is the New England or Boston clam chowder, and it is cream based. You can see here that you see whiteness in the broth because there is cream in it, or milk. It has potatoes. Typically it'll have a little bit of bacon or something in it too, but of course clams. Then we have something that is not as commonly consumed or thought of, and that's Rhode Island clam chowder, and it is a clear broth, right? Clear broth, and it can have, this one clearly has some kind of herb in it, but it typically has some kind of pork product along with the clam, and in this case, these are quahogs. So those of you who know Family Guy would understand that term, the quahogs, but these types of clams are called quahogs, and this one, it looks like it might have some pork sausage, but typically it's bacon included in there. And the last one is Manhattan clam chowder. No, that's not New England. That is from the Mid-Atlantic, but we're going to talk about it anyway. Manhattan being one of the 5 boroughs, the island of New York City. And it is just a tomato based, so you can see that it is red because of the tomato base of the clam chowder. And if I were to choose which of these 3 that I like the best, it is always the New England clam chowder because, of course, I love cream. So other things to know about New England, we talked about puddings, and then we talk about pies. Again, an England to New England connection. So New England has pies, and the pies that were commonly made historically were made with suet pastry. So what is suet? Suet is a fat from typically a cow, and it's not just any fat, but it is the fat that it surrounds the kidneys. So it is what it is. So when we think of steak and kidney pie, steak being cow, right? Kidney, the kidney of the cow, coming together to be made into a pie, and the pie pastry having suet from the kidney fat. Okay, then chicken pot pie, lobster pie, apple pie, all those things common to New England, and then mincemeat pie. And mincemeat pie has a long history and tradition, but it's not as commonly consumed these days as it used to be. But mincemeat is minced meat, right? So cut up, or sometimes now we think of it as ground meat. Could be lamb or beef or some other kind of wild game. But then it has dried fruit in it. So it might have dried apples or cherries, blueberries, raisins, whatever. It will have some kind of alcohol, like rum or something in it to help with preserving it. And it's got spices that traditionally so this is got meat in it, which always sounds weird to me, meat, but it's actually a sweeter kind of dish because it has the fruit in it, and the flavorings are common Christmas flavorings of cinnamon, clove, and nutmeg, right? So those are things when you think of pumpkin pie and things like that, maybe those are the flavors you would think of. So that's mincemeat pie. You do need to know that one. New England has lots of different sweets. The maple syrup candies are popular, right, because of maple trees. Cranberries and blueberries are very common. That's one of my favorite things about New England is being able to get yummy blueberries, and oh, I love cranberries too. Just FYI, I can eat a whole thing, like a whole, I mean, I make it from scratch, but if you ever have a can of cranberry sauce around, I could eat one whole thing by myself. It's not a condiment to me. Side note. And desserts are in New England are often fruit-based. We have pandaudes, which are these. This is a version of it, but it's basically dough and berries or some kind of fruit mixed together, kind of like a cake, but not really. So yeah, that's a pandaude. Shortbread. That most of you are familiar with. And then roly-polies. So this is what I call a roly-poly. It's fruit and dough rolled. Really, it's a jelly roll, right? Or a fruit roll. But these days we use jam and stuff in it, so it's a jelly roll. But they're also called roly-polies. And that comes again from the England thought on it. And then apple cider as well. It is super common in New England because apple trees in the fall are, apple picking is a sport in New England. Super fun. So that is the wrap up of New England food and cuisine. Hopefully you enjoyed that little bit of touch of history, knowing that the foods that were consumed still can be consumed, and there's a blend of that and just globalization in New England. So if you have any questions, please let me know. I am happy to help.